The whisper reached Mira Ashgrove before the sun did. She was carrying a tray of silver cups down the east corridor of Blackthorn Keep when she heard two guards speaking low behind a pillar. One word slipped out clearly: Arrow. She did not slow her steps. She never slowed her steps. A maid who paused to listen was a maid who got noticed, and Mira had spent 3 years making sure nobody in this castle noticed her at all. But her hands tightened around the tray, and one cup rattled against another. Today was the day the rival packs arrived at Blackthorn Keep for the Peace Summit. Every hallway had been scrubbed twice. Every guard had been given new orders. And somewhere in the walls of this castle, according to the guards she had just overheard, someone was planning to make sure the summit never happened at all. Mira reached the servants' stairs and finally let her breath out. She should not have cared. She was nobody here. A girl who mopped floors and folded linens and carried trays nobody thanked her for. But some old part of her, a part she kept locked away like a door she refused to open, pulled tight in her chest every time she heard the word danger inside these walls. She pushed the door open with her hip and stepped into the kitchen, where the cook, a round, kind woman named Agatha, was shouting at 2 younger girls about burnt bread. "You're pale," Agatha said the moment she saw her. "Sit down before you drop that tray." "I'm fine," Mira said, setting the tray on the counter with careful hands. "Just tired." Agatha studied her for a moment longer than Mira liked. Agatha always looked at her a moment too long, as if she could see something under Mira's skin that nobody else could. But she said nothing more, only pressed a warm roll into Mira's palm and told her to eat before she fainted in front of the whole court. Mira ate the roll on her way back up the stairs, because arguing with Agatha wasted more time than eating did. By mid-morning, the great hall of Blackthorn Keep had filled with more nobility than Mira had ever seen in one room. Banners from 4 packs hung from the rafters, each one a different color, each one representing a family that did not fully trust the other 3. At the center of it all sat the throne, empty for now, waiting for the man everyone in the room both feared and depended on. Alpha King Draven Voss ruled over the strongest pack in the region, and he had called this summit himself, against the advice of nearly every person close to him. Peace, he had said, was worth the risk. His council had argued for weeks that peace was exactly the kind of thing that got a king killed. Mira had heard all of this while dusting shelves nobody ever checked. She had learned, over 3 years of being invisible, that people spoke freely in front of maids the same way they spoke freely in front of chairs and lamps. She was furniture to them, furniture with ears. 3 years ago, Mira had arrived at Blackthorn Keep with nothing but a borrowed name and a bag she could carry on one shoulder. She had asked for the lowest position in the castle, the one nobody else wanted, because the lowest position came with the least attention, and attention was the one thing she could not afford. She scrubbed floors until her knuckles cracked. She had built her safety out of being forgettable, and for 3 years it had held. She slipped along the back wall of the hall with a jug of water, refilling cups nobody asked her to refill, watching the way the 4 packs eyed one another across the room like dogs deciding whether to fight or wait. The Frostborn pack sat stiff and silent on the left. The Ashvale pack whispered among themselves on the right, and near the front, closest to the throne, sat the pack elders of Draven's own council, led by a thin, sharp-faced man named Edmund Caro, who smiled more than anyone else in the room and meant it least. Mira did not like Edmund Caro. She had never been able to say exactly why. He had never spoken a harsh word to her, had barely spoken to her at all, but something about the way his eyes moved, calm and calculating even when the rest of him smiled, made the hair on her arms rise every time he passed. A horn sounded outside the hall, announcing the king's arrival, and the entire room rose to its feet. Draven Voss walked in like a man who carried the weight of 4 packs on his shoulders and had long ago stopped noticing the weight. He was tall, broad through the chest, with dark hair pushed back from a face that rarely smiled and eyes that missed very little. Mira had refilled his water glass perhaps 100 times over 3 years, had stood 2 feet from him more times than she could count, and in all that time he had looked directly at her exactly twice. She told herself it did not matter. Kings did not look at maids. That was simply how the world worked, and she had built her whole quiet life around making sure it stayed that way. He took his seat on the throne, and the summit began. For the first hour, it was mostly words. The pack leaders spoke of borders, and trade, and old grievances that stretched back further than anyone in the room had been alive. Draven listened more than he spoke, which Mira had noticed was rare among men who wore crowns. When he did speak, the room quieted in a way that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with respect, which was rarer still. Mira kept moving along the walls, refilling cups, adjusting candles, doing the small invisible work that kept a room like this running. And the whole time, the whisper from that morning sat in her chest like a stone. Arrow. She scanned the hall without meaning to, checking the high windows, the balconies above, the shadowed archways where a person with a bow might stand unseen. She saw nothing, but the feeling would not leave her. Near the second hour, Edmund Caro rose to speak, and something in his voice changed the temperature of the room. He spoke of unity, of trust, of how far the packs had come to finally sit together in peace. His words were smooth as poured honey, and Mira watched Draven's face carefully as the man spoke, because she had learned that Draven's face told the truth even when everyone else's mouth did not. Draven's jaw was tight. He did not trust the speech either. Mira moved closer to the front of the hall, closer than a maid usually dared, refilling a cup that did not need refilling, because something in her would not let her stay at the back of the room a moment longer. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself the whisper she had overheard that morning was probably about something small, a stolen blade, a drunken threat, nothing that would actually happen in a hall full of armed guards and 4 watching packs. She did not believe herself. She glanced up toward the high windows one more time, the ones that lined the eastern wall of the hall, tall and arched and mostly ignored because no one expected danger to come from above in a room this heavily guarded. A shape moved in the shadow of the third window. It was there and gone in less than a second, a flicker of dark cloth against darker stone, so brief that Mira almost convinced herself she had imagined it. Almost. But 3 years of watching this castle without being watched herself had trained her eyes to notice things other people missed, and every instinct she owned told her that shape had not been a servant and had not been a guard. She looked toward Draven. He sat forward slightly in his throne, still listening to Edmund Caro's smooth, unhurried words, completely unaware that something in the shadows above him had just shifted. Mira's heart began to pound in a way that had nothing to do with fear for herself. She took one step forward, then stopped herself, because a maid did not interrupt a peace summit between 4 packs to point at a shadow that might have been nothing at all. If she was wrong, she would be dragged out of the hall and likely dismissed from the castle entirely. If she was wrong twice, she might be questioned in ways she could not afford to be questioned, not with the secrets she carried buried so carefully beneath her plain gray dress. But if she was right, and she said nothing, a king would die in front of 4 packs who barely trusted each other, and the fragile peace this summit was built to create would die with him. She looked up at the window again. The shape was gone. For one long, terrible breath, Mira told herself she had imagined the whole thing, that exhaustion and an overheard whisper had built a shadow into something it was not. She let her shoulders loosen. She let herself believe, just for a moment, that the danger had passed. Then she heard the sound. It was small, almost nothing, a soft creak of wood pulled taut, the kind of sound a bow makes in the half-second before it releases an arrow, and Mira's whole body went cold with the certainty that she had not imagined anything at all. She turned toward the throne. Draven Voss sat exactly where he had sat all morning, upright, unaware, his attention still fixed on Edmund Caro's honeyed words, his back a perfect, open target for anyone positioned above the eastern windows with a clear line of sight. She had spent 3 years training herself to be invisible, to move without sound, to disappear into the edges of every room she entered. In this single heartbeat, none of that mattered. Every quiet lesson she had taught herself fell away, and something older, something buried far beneath the maid's dress and the borrowed name, rose up and told her feet exactly where to go. Mira did not think. She moved. The arrow left the shadows of the eastern window before anyone else in the hall even understood a threat existed. Mira crossed the space between the back wall and the throne, faster than she had ever moved in her life, faster than a maid should have been able to move at all, though in that single breath, nobody was watching her closely enough to notice. All eyes were on Edmund Caro, still speaking his smooth, unhurried words, still holding the attention of 4 packs who had no idea that death was already falling toward their king. She reached Draven a half-second before the arrow did. There was no time to shout a warning, no time to think about what would happen next, no time to weigh the cost of what she was about to do against the quiet, hidden life she had spent 3 years protecting. There was only the throne, and the king seated in it, and the narrow window of space where a body could still make a difference. Mira threw herself between the arrow and the king. The impact staggered her sideways, a burning line of pain across her shoulder that stole the breath from her lungs before she even understood what had happened. She hit the stone floor hard, one hand catching the edge of the throne's dais, the silver water jug shattering somewhere beside her in a spray of glass and water that nobody in the hall would remember later, because every eye in the room had turned toward the sound of a body falling in front of the king. For one long, silent moment, nobody moved at all. Then the hall exploded into noise. Guards shouted and drew their weapons, fanning out toward the eastern windows, where the shape had vanished before anyone else had even registered it existed. The 4 packs rose from their seats in a tangle of confusion and alarm, some reaching for hidden blades out of instinct, others simply staring at the maid crumpled on the floor in front of the throne, unable to understand what they were seeing. Draven Voss was on his knees beside her before his own guards reached him. "Get the healer," he said, and his voice, usually calm and measured in every room Mira had ever heard it in, cracked with something raw and urgent that she had never heard from him before. Now. Mira's shoulder burned like it had been dipped in fire, a deep, spreading heat that had nothing to do with a normal wound. She had seen enough injuries in 3 years of castle work to know what an arrow wound was supposed to feel like, a sharp, contained pain that stayed where it struck. This was different. This heat was moving, sliding beneath her skin like it had somewhere else to be, and beneath the pain, a colder thought settled into her chest with terrible clarity. The arrow had been poisoned. She had felt it the moment it struck, some old instinct recognizing the wrongness of the pain even before her mind caught up. A wound from a poisoned arrow did not simply hurt. It spread. It hunted through the body looking for the heart, and once it found its way there was very little any healer could do. Mira. She had never heard Draven say her name before. In 3 years of pouring his water and dusting his shelves, she had been nothing more to him than a shape at the edge of the room, and yet here he was, kneeling on the cold stone floor of his own great hall, saying her name like it mattered, like she mattered, his hands pressing carefully against the wound in her shoulder, as if pressure alone could hold the poison back. "You shouldn't have done that," he said, and his voice shook in a way kings were not supposed to let their voices shake. Mira tried to answer him, tried to tell him that she would do it again without hesitation, but the words came out broken and quiet, swallowed by the growing crowd of guards and nobles pressing closer to see what had happened. Somewhere behind Draven's shoulder, she caught a glimpse of Edmund Caro standing very still, his smooth, unhurried expression gone, replaced by something Mira did not have time to name before her vision blurred at the edges. The healer arrived within moments, an older woman with steady hands and a face lined by decades of tending to wounds far worse than this one. She examined the wound quickly, her fingers gentle but efficient, and when she looked up at Draven, her expression told him everything her words had not yet said. "The arrow was poisoned," the healer said quietly, "night root, by the color of it. Fast-acting. She has minutes, not hours." The words landed in the hall like a second arrow, and the noise around them dropped into a heavy, frightened silence. Nightroot poison was not something anyone survived without a rare and difficult cure, one that took hours to prepare, even when the ingredients were close at hand, which they were not. Every person in that hall, from the pack leaders to the youngest guard, understood exactly what those minutes meant. Draven did not move from Mira's side. "Prepare the cure," he ordered, his voice sharp enough to cut through the fear settling over the room. "I don't care what it costs or how long it takes to gather. Prepare it." "Your Majesty," the healer said gently, "there isn't time. The poison will reach her heart before the cure is ready. I am sorry, there is nothing more to be done." Mira felt the truth of the healer's words in the way her own body was beginning to respond, a heaviness settling into her limbs, a strange cold numbness creeping up from the wound in her shoulder toward her chest. She should have been afraid. Some distant part of her understood that she was dying, that the poison the healer described was already moving through her exactly the way poison was supposed to move through a human body, hunting, spreading, closing in. But she was not human, and the poison did not know that yet. Deep beneath her skin, in the place she had spent 3 years locking away and denying and burying under a borrowed name, something ancient stirred awake. It was not something she called forward on purpose. It came the way instinct always came, unbidden, unstoppable, older than the fear currently gripping the room around her. Draven felt it before he saw it. His hand, still pressed against her wound, registered a change in the heat beneath her skin, a shift from the wrongness of poison to something else entirely, something that pulsed and gathered and began, impossibly, to knit the torn flesh back together beneath his fingers. "What?" he said quietly, and did not finish the question. Mira's eyes opened. They were not the soft brown eyes Draven had glanced at exactly twice in 3 years of sharing this castle. They had changed, shifted into a deep molten gold flecked with threads of silver, a color that did not belong to any ordinary wolf in any ordinary pack, a color that made the healer gasp and stumble backward, a color that made every pack leader in the hall go utterly still. The wound beneath Draven's hand had already closed. Gasps rippled through the crowd like wind moving through tall grass, spreading from the front of the hall toward the back, until every person present had either seen the transformation themselves or heard it described in a frightened whisper from someone who had. A maid, poisoned by an arrow meant for the king, should have been dead within minutes. Instead, she lay on the stone floor with a wound that no longer existed, her eyes burning a color that belonged to legends and old stories, not to castle servants. "That's not possible," someone said from the crowd, though Mira could not tell who. "Get back," Draven ordered the guards, pressing closer, though his own hand did not move from where it had rested against the now healed skin of her shoulder. His eyes, dark and unreadable, stayed fixed on her face, searching it as though he had never truly looked at her before, as though 3 years of glancing past a quiet maid had suddenly collapsed into this single, impossible moment. Mira tried to sit up, and the room tilted around her, dizzy from whatever had just happened inside her own body, the healing as strange and disorienting to her as it was to everyone watching. She had felt this power before, once, a very long time ago, in a life she had spent years trying to forget existed at all. She had hoped, foolishly, that it had died along with everyone who used to know her true name. It had not. The healer, still kneeling beside Mira, with her hands hovering uselessly over a wound that no longer existed, looked up at Draven with an expression caught between fear and wonder. She had spent decades tending to injuries in this castle, had seen wolves heal faster than humans ever could, had seen strength and speed and senses that outmatched anything ordinary. She had never seen a wound close itself in the space of a single breath, the torn flesh knitting back together as though it had simply changed its mind about being wounded at all. "I have never seen anything like this," the healer admitted quietly, more to herself than to anyone listening. "Not in 40 years of service." The pack leaders along the sides of the hall had risen fully to their feet now, no longer hiding their unease behind careful court manners. The Frostborn elders whispered among themselves in low, rapid voices, and even the usually composed leader of the Ashvale pack had gone pale, one hand resting on the hilt of a blade he had not drawn since he was young enough to need lessons in using it. Draven raised a hand, and the noise in the hall dropped, not because his authority commanded silence, though it usually did, but because every person present understood, on some level, that they had just witnessed something that would need to be explained before anyone left this room. "Someone explain this." Edmund Caro's voice cut through the murmuring crowd, sharp and demanding in a way his earlier honeyed speech had never been. A maid does not simply heal from nightroot poison. There is only one bloodline in this region that carries that kind of power, and every member of it was destroyed years ago. The word bloodline settled over Mira like a second wound, one that hurt far worse than the arrow had. She looked up and found Draven still watching her, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and a dawning, terrible understanding, as though pieces of a puzzle he had never known existed were suddenly arranging themselves in front of him. The guards around them had gone silent. The pack leaders had gone silent. Even Edmund Caro had stopped speaking. And in that silence, Mira understood with total clarity that the quiet, invisible life she had built over 3 careful years had just ended in front of every powerful person in the region. "Mira," Draven said again, softer this time, though there was nothing soft about the question underneath it. "Who are you?" She did not answer right away. She could not. 3 years of careful silence had built a wall around the truth so thick that even now, with her wound healed and her secret already spilling out in front of 100 witnesses, some old instinct told her to keep her mouth shut and let the moment pass. But the moment did not pass. Edmund Caro stepped forward from the crowd, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made the cold beneath her skin turn colder still, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost every trace of the smooth, honeyed tone he used in council meetings. "Ashgrove," he said, as though testing the shape of the word in his mouth. "That's the name, isn't it? I would know that gold in your eyes anywhere. I watched your family burn." The hall, already silent, went utterly still. Mira felt the truth of her own name settle over her like a blade she had spent 3 years trying to avoid. And for the first time since she had arrived at Blackthorn Keep, with nothing but a borrowed identity and a bag she could carry on one shoulder, she understood that there was no walking away from this hall unchanged, no returning to the quiet, forgettable life of a maid who scrubbed floors and refilled cups nobody thanked her for. Draven rose slowly to his feet, his hand finally leaving her shoulder, though his eyes never once left her face. He looked around the hall at the pack leaders staring at Mira like she was something out of a story their grandparents used to tell, at the guards who no longer knew whether to protect her or fear her, at Edmund Caro standing perfectly still with an expression Mira could not read, and something in his posture shifted, straightened, the weight of a king settling back over him even as confusion still lived plainly in his eyes. "Whatever she is," Draven said, his voice carrying across the hall with the quiet authority of a man used to being obeyed, "she took an arrow meant for me. That is the only fact that matters in this room right now." Nobody argued with him, not out loud, though Mira could see the doubt on more than one face, the fear that had not softened simply because the king had spoken. She pushed herself upright with unsteady arms, the healed skin beneath her torn dress still tender in a way that had nothing to do with pain and everything to do with memory, old and buried and suddenly, unavoidably alive again. The truth was already out. And Edmund Caro, of all people, had been the one to say it first. They moved Mira to a private chamber before the hall could descend fully into chaos, Draven himself giving the order, his voice leaving no room for argument even from pack leaders who technically answered to no one but their own councils. 2 guards carried her, though her legs worked well enough now, the strange gold fading slowly from her eyes, as whatever ancient thing had woken inside her settled back beneath her skin. She sat on the edge of a narrow bed in a room she had cleaned 100 times without ever once expecting to occupy it herself, and waited for the questions she knew were coming. Draven arrived alone. He closed the door behind him, and for a long moment he simply stood there, studying her, the way a man studies a familiar painting after learning it hides something behind the paint. Mira kept her hands folded in her lap, her borrowed gray dress torn at the shoulder, the skin beneath it whole and unmarked, as though nothing had happened there at all. "Edmund said your family burned," Draven said finally. Not a question. A door he was holding open, waiting to see if she would walk through it. Mira looked at her hands. "Yes." He said Ashgrove, that there was only one bloodline with that kind of healing. "Yes." Mira. He said her name the same way he had said it kneeling on the floor of the great hall, careful, deliberate, as though testing whether it still fit her now that he knew it belonged to someone else too. "Who are you really?" She had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in the quiet hours of the night, lying awake in the servants' quarters, imagining what she would say if anyone ever discovered the truth. In every version she had ever imagined, she ran. She packed her single bag and disappeared before the sun rose, the way she had disappeared from 3 other places before Blackthorn Keep. She had never once imagined a version where she simply sat and told the truth and stayed to face whatever came after. But there was no bag to pack this time, and nowhere left to run, that Edmund Caro would not eventually find her. "My name is Mira," she said quietly. "That much was never a lie, but my family name was never Ashgrove, not the one I was born with. Ashgrove was the name my grandmother gave up when she fled here, 12 years before I was born, choosing a quiet, forgettable name over the one that used to mean something." Draven waited, silent, letting her find the rest of the words on her own time. "My true family name was Renfell," she said. "We ruled the Northern Territories once, before your father's reign ever began. My bloodline carried a gift older than most packs remember, a healing that runs deeper than ordinary wolf strength, tied to blood and to a very old kind of magic that most people believe died out generations ago. We were not simply another pack among many. We were meant to be guardians, protectors, bound to defend whichever throne needed defending most, wherever the danger was greatest." "That's not a story I've heard," Draven said quietly. "No one has heard it in a very long time. Because 12 years before I was born, and again when I was a child of 8, the Renfell line was hunted, twice." Her voice did not shake, though the memory beneath the words very much did. "The first purge scattered what remained of us into hiding. The second purge, when I was 8 years old, was meant to finish the job entirely." Draven's face had gone very still. Whose order was the second purge? Mira looked up at him then, and for the first time since he had walked into the room, she let him see exactly how much this next sentence cost her. "Your father's." The silence that followed was longer and heavier than any silence in the Great Hall had been. "My father died believing every royal healer bloodline in this region posed a threat to his rule," Draven said slowly, as though working through a memory he had never fully understood until this moment. "He called it removing old dangers. I was young. I never asked what that meant in practice. It meant soldiers came to my family's home, in the middle of the night," Mira said. "It meant my grandmother, who had already given up everything once, to protect what was left of us, gave up everything a second time. She hid me in a grain cellar with a girl 3 years older than me, a girl I never learned the full name of because there was no time for names that night, only time for silence and darkness and the sound of a house burning above us. She could still remember the smell of the grain cellar if she let herself think about it long enough, dust and old wood, and beneath it, faint but unmistakable even to an 8-year-old, the smell of smoke seeping down through the floorboards above. The older girl beside her had not cried, not once, though her hand had trembled every time a shout carried down from the courtyard. She had kept her palm pressed firmly over Mira's mouth long after Mira had stopped needing the reminder to stay silent, as though the act of holding her quiet was the only thing keeping the older girl steady herself. They had stayed in that cellar until well past sunrise, long after the shouting stopped, long after the smoke smell had thinned into something colder and more final. When they finally climbed out, there had been nothing left standing that Mira recognized as home, only blackened stone, and a silence so complete it had felt like its own kind of sound. She never saw the older girl again after that morning, separated within hours by frightened relatives who scattered in every direction they could manage, and for years afterward, Mira had wondered whether that girl had survived at all, or whether she had simply been another name added to a count nobody official ever bothered to keep. She stopped there. Draven did not push her further, though she could see the question still waiting behind his eyes. Patient, careful, the same patience he showed the pack leaders when he wanted to hear the whole truth before speaking again. "I was the only one who survived," Mira said finally. "My grandmother did not. My parents did not. Every cousin, every uncle, every child who shared my blood, gone in a single night, because your father decided our gift made us dangerous rather than useful. I was 8 years old, and I spent the next 6 years being moved from one hiding family to another, learning a new borrowed name every time someone got nervous about keeping me, until I was old enough to choose my own hiding places instead of waiting for someone else to choose them for me. And you chose here." Draven's voice had gone rough in a way Mira had never heard from him before, not even in council meetings where tempers usually ran hottest. "You chose to hide in my castle, in the home of the family that destroyed yours." "I chose the last place anyone would think to look," Mira said simply. "Nobody searches for a hunted bloodline inside the walls of the throne that hunted them. It was the safest hiding place I had found in 6 years of hiding." Draven walked to the narrow window of the chamber and stood there for a long moment, looking out at nothing in particular, his back to her, the way hers had once been turned toward danger without her knowing it. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried a weight Mira recognized immediately, the weight of a man measuring the size of a debt he had just discovered he owed. 3 years, he said. 3 years you served in this castle, knowing what my family did to yours, and you never once tried to harm me. You never poisoned a cup, never left a door unlocked for someone who might. You had every reason in the world to want me dead, and instead, today, you put yourself between me and an arrow. I thought about it," Mira admitted quietly. "In the beginning. I won't pretend the thought never crossed my mind, watching you sit on a throne my family used to be sworn to protect, knowing your father had ended that oath in blood instead of simply retiring it with honor. But hating you for something your father did felt like exactly the kind of thinking that started the purge in the first place. He decided an entire bloodline was dangerous because of what we were born as, not because of anything we had actually done. I was not willing to become the same kind of person who did that to my family, even in my own head." Draven turned back to face her, and something in his expression had shifted, softened at the edges, in a way Mira had never seen from him in 3 years of glancing past her in crowded rooms. "The Renfell bloodline," he said slowly, "guardians bound to protect a throne. Is that instinct or choice?" Mira considered the question carefully before answering, because it was a question she had asked herself more than once in the quiet hours since discovering what her body could do. "Both, I think. The healing itself is instinct. It woke up today because my body needed it to survive, the same way it would have woken for any Renfell facing death by poison. But throwing myself in front of that arrow before I even knew it was poisoned, before I knew healing would save me at all, that was a choice. I made it before I understood the cost." "Why?" The question hung in the small room between them, simple and enormous at once, and Mira found she did not have a clean, prepared answer the way she had for every question before it. "I don't fully know," she admitted. "Perhaps some part of the old oath survives in the blood, even when the rest of the family sworn to it does not. Perhaps I simply could not stand in the back of that hall and watch a man die in front of 4 packs when I had the ability to stop it, whatever the cost turned out to be. I have spent 6 years hiding what I am, Draven. I did not expect the first time I used it in the open to be for the son of the man who tried to end my family." Draven crossed the room and knelt in front of her, the same way he had knelt on the stone floor of the great hall, though this time there was no wound to press against, no poison racing toward her heart, only the quiet weight of everything she had just told him settling into the space between them. "I am sorry," he said, and the words came out rough, unpracticed, a king unused to apologizing for anything, let alone for the actions of a father he had buried years ago. "I did not know what my father ordered. That is not an excuse. It is simply the truth. But I am sorry, Mira Renfell, for every part of what your family suffered under his crown." Hearing her true family name spoken aloud, in his voice, in this small room, did something to Mira's chest that she was not prepared for. She had not heard that name spoken since she was 8 years old, hiding in a grain cellar with a stranger's hand pressed over her mouth to keep her silent while her whole world burned above her. 6 years of Ashgrove, of Mira with no family name at all worth mentioning, of borrowed identities worn like coats she could shed the moment danger came close enough to smell them. "Nobody has called me that in a very long time," she said quietly. "Then I will be careful with it," Draven said, "because I suspect it costs you something every time you hear it." Mira almost smiled, the first real urge toward one she had felt since the whisper of arrow had reached her that morning. "It does, though perhaps not the cost you think. I have spent 6 years wishing someone would say it and mean something kind by it, rather than a threat." They sat together in that small room for a while longer, the castle beyond the door still humming with the shock of what the great hall had witnessed. Pack leaders undoubtedly already sending urgent messages to their own territories, guards undoubtedly already doubling their watch on every window and every door. But for a few quiet minutes, none of that reached the narrow chamber where a king and the last surviving Renfell sat with a truth finally spoken between them, unsure yet what it would cost either of them, but no longer willing to pretend it had not been said. Later that evening, once Draven had gone to address the shaken pack leaders still gathered in the great hall, Agatha came to sit with Mira in the narrow chamber, carrying a tray of food that neither of them touched. The old cook studied her for a long moment, the same searching look she had given Mira that very morning, only now there was no need to pretend the look meant nothing. "You knew," Mira said quietly. "It was not quite a question." "I suspected," Agatha admitted. 3 years is a long time to watch a girl move through a kitchen without ever once burning herself on a hot pan or cutting herself on a blade, no matter how tired her hands looked. I told myself it was simply caution. Some small part of me always wondered if it was something else." She reached out and covered Mira's hand with her own, work-worn and steady. "I am glad it was something else, and I am glad you are still sitting here to tell me so." Mira felt something in her chest loosen slightly for the first time since the whisper of arrow had reached her that morning, a small, unexpected comfort in being known, even partly, by someone who had chosen to stay quiet about her suspicions rather than report them. She had spent 6 years assuming that discovery would always mean danger. She had not considered, until this strange, exhausting day, that it might also mean being seen. Outside, unseen by either of them, Edmund Caro stood in the shadowed hall beyond the door, listening. He had heard enough. The name Renfell, spoken aloud in the king's own voice, confirmed a suspicion Edmund had carried quietly for years, ever since whispers had reached him of a Renfell child who might have survived the second purge his own family had helped orchestrate at the old king's side. He had assumed, as everyone had assumed, that the child had died somewhere in hiding, one more loose thread trimmed away by time if not by design. He had been wrong, and now the girl sat inside the castle walls, healed and healthy and worse, protected by a king who had just apologized to her for a debt Edmund had spent years making certain nobody would ever have to pay. Edmund Caro turned from the door and walked back toward his own chambers with the unhurried, measured steps of a man who had learned patience from years of court politics, already turning over in his mind exactly what needed to happen next, and exactly how much time he had left before that girl became a problem too large for even his careful planning to remove quietly. By morning, news of what happened in the Great Hall had spread through Blackthorn Keep faster than any fire could have carried it. Servants whispered in the corridors. Guards traded rumors at the changing of every watch. And by the time Draven called his council together to address the matter formally, every pack leader still present at the summit had already formed an opinion about what should happen to the maid who called herself Mira Ashgrove. The council chamber was smaller than the Great Hall, but the tension inside it felt heavier, packed tight around a long table where Draven sat at the head, Mira seated to his right in a clean dress that still felt strange against skin that had healed itself from poison less than a day earlier. Edmund Caro sat near the far end, composed, watchful, his earlier honeyed tone replaced by something colder and more careful. "A Renfell," said Lord Callum Bryce, leader of the Frostborn pack, testing the word like it left a bitter taste. "Sitting at this table, I confess I did not expect to see that particular ghost walk back into daylight." "She is not a ghost," Draven said evenly. "She is a woman who took an arrow meant for me and survived it. That is the only fact this council needs to concern itself with." "With respect, Your Majesty," said Lady Helena Frost, the Ashvale Pack's representative, her voice careful but firm. "The fact that concerns this council is considerably larger than one arrow. The Renfell bloodline was tied to old prophecy long before your father's reign. Guardians bound by blood to whichever throne they served. Some among the old packs believed that binding came with obligations that ran in both directions. If she is truly the last of that line, her presence here is not simply a personal matter for you. It touches every pack that remembers the old oaths." Mira sat very still, aware of every eye at the table now turned toward her, weighing her, measuring her the way Edmund Caro had measured her the moment her secret first spilled into the open. She had spent 6 years avoiding rooms exactly like this one, full of powerful people deciding what her existence meant for their own interests. "What obligations?" Draven asked. "Are you suggesting she owes this council?" "None, perhaps," Lady Helena said. "Or all of them, depending on which old story you choose to believe. That is precisely the difficulty, Your Majesty. Nobody at this table has lived long enough to know for certain which version is true, and a bloodline capable of surviving nightroot poison is not something any of us can afford to guess wrong about." Edmund Caro leaned forward slightly, his hands folded on the table in front of him, his expression carefully neutral in a way that Mira, after a lifetime of reading danger in careful expressions, did not trust for a single moment. "There is a simpler concern," Edmund said. "Whoever fired that arrow yesterday knew exactly where to aim and exactly when to strike, during a summit meant to secure peace between 4 packs who do not fully trust one another. That person remains unfound, and now this council learns that a member of a bloodline once considered dangerous enough to eliminate has been living inside this castle for 3 years under a false name, undetected by every guard and every council member present. I would ask, respectfully, how confident this council can truly be that she poses no further danger, hidden or otherwise." "She saved my life," Draven said, his voice sharpening, "at the cost of revealing a secret she had protected for 6 years. That is not the behavior of someone plotting against this throne. Or, Edmund said smoothly, it is precisely the behavior of someone clever enough to know that saving your life would buy her exactly the protection and trust she needed to move freely within these walls from this day forward." The accusation landed hard, and Mira felt heat rise in her chest that had nothing to do with poison this time. She had known, from the moment Edmund Caro named her bloodline in front of the entire hall, that this conversation was coming. She had simply hoped it would take longer to arrive. "I did not plan to be shot with a poisoned arrow," she said, and her voice, though quiet, carried clearly across the table. "I did not plan for my healing to reveal itself in front of 4 packs. If I had wanted to remain hidden, Lord Caro, I would have stayed exactly where I was standing at the back of that hall and let the arrow find its mark. Nobody would have questioned a maid who simply failed to warn anyone in time. I chose otherwise, at a cost I understood the moment I moved, and I would make the same choice again without hesitation." The room went quiet for a moment, several of the pack leaders exchanging glances that suggested her words had landed with more weight than Edmund's accusation had. Regardless of her intentions, Lord Callum said carefully. This council still faces a practical problem. Whoever fired that arrow remains free within or near this castle. If Edmund is correct that the Renfell bloodline carries obligations toward a throne, then perhaps the more useful question is not what danger she poses, but what protection she might offer, now that her gift is known rather than hidden. You would use her, Draven said, his tone flat and unimpressed, as a tool against whoever attempted to end my life yesterday. I would use every resource available to protect the peace this summit was meant to secure, Lord Callum said, including, if she is willing, a healer whose blood apparently refuses to let poison finish its work. Mira glanced sideways at Draven, uncertain how she felt about being discussed, as though she were a weapon to be assigned, rather than a person permitted an opinion of her own, though she understood, even as the frustration rose in her, that this was simply how councils like this one operated. She had avoided rooms like it for 6 years precisely because she knew this was how they operated. I am willing to help protect this throne, Mira said, before Draven could answer for her, not because an old oath binds me to it, and not because Lord Caro believes it proves my innocence. I am willing because a king who did not order the deaths of my family sat beside me yesterday and apologized for what his father did, and because I would rather see peace hold between 4 packs than watch it collapse into the kind of violence that destroyed everything I once had. That is my choice to offer, freely, and it should be received as exactly that, a choice, not an obligation owed. Draven's expression shifted slightly at her words, something that might have been pride, or relief, or simply gratitude that she had chosen to speak for herself rather than let the council decide her value without her. Edmund Caro's composed expression did not shift at all, and that, more than anything said at the table so far, told Mira exactly how far she still had to go before this council, or the man watching her most carefully within it, would ever fully trust what she had just offered. A generous offer, Edmund said, though generous offers, in my experience, deserve careful watching all the same. Careful watching, Draven said, is something this entire council has already committed to, Edmund, regarding the true matter at hand. An assassin remains free. I would prefer this table spend its remaining time discussing how we find that person, rather than continuing to interrogate the woman who nearly died stopping them. The conversation shifted, reluctantly, toward the investigation itself, guards reporting what little evidence had been recovered near the eastern windows, a single dropped glove of fine make that suggested the attacker had access to expensive materials, footprints leading toward a servant's passage rarely used, and a length of rope that had allowed for a quick escape along the outer wall before guards had even finished securing the hall. Mira listened carefully, cataloging every detail the way she had learned to catalog details over 3 years of being furniture with ears, though she said little else for the remainder of the meeting, aware that Edmund Caro's eyes returned to her more often than any other person's, watching her reactions with a patience that unsettled her more than his earlier accusations had. When the council finally adjourned, Draven walked with her back toward the private chamber she had occupied since the arrow struck, the corridor quiet around them in a castle still absorbing the shock of everything the previous day had revealed. You didn't have to offer yourself to that council, he said quietly. I know, Mira said, but I would rather choose my own part in this than have Lord Callum assign one to me without asking. Draven considered this for a moment. Edmund does not believe you. Edmund does not believe anyone, Mira said. I noticed that the very first week I arrived at this castle. He smiles at everyone equally and trusts no one at all. It used to unsettle me before I understood. It was simply how he survived long enough to sit at that table. Does it still unsettle you? Mira thought about the eavesdropping she had not yet told him she suspected, the shadow outside the chamber door the previous night that Agatha had mentioned in passing, a shape that had lingered longer near their private conversation than any innocent passerby should have. She was not certain enough yet to accuse a council member of listening at doors, not without proof that could be turned back against her the moment she spoke it aloud. More than it used to, she said carefully, though I cannot yet say exactly why. Draven studied her for a long moment, the same searching look he had given her in the council chamber, and Mira understood that whatever trust had grown between them in the single day since the arrow struck, it was still fragile enough that neither of them fully knew its shape yet, nor how much weight it could bear once Edmund Caro decided to test it. That evening, a young guard named Nathaniel Foss came to find Draven with news from the investigation, and Mira, still seated near the window of her chamber, was invited to hear it directly rather than wait for a summary passed through someone else. Nathaniel had been assigned to search the servants' passage near the eastern windows, the same route Edmund had mentioned briefly during the council meeting, and he had found something the earlier search had missed in the confusion of the previous day. A second glove, Nathaniel said, laying a small scrap of fine dark leather on the table between them, matched in make to the one recovered near the window. Whoever wore this pair has hands smaller than most guards on regular watch, and the leather itself is imported, not the kind sold in any shop within a day's ride of Blackthorn Keep. Imported from where? Draven asked. The southern trading routes, most likely, Nathaniel said. Expensive, the kind of leather a noble might wear, or someone in close service to one. Mira turned the small scrap of leather over in her fingers once Nathaniel offered it to her, an old habit from years of paying close attention to small details that others dismissed too quickly. The stitching along the seam was fine, deliberate, done by a hand with training rather than haste, and something about the pattern along the cuff struck her as familiar in a way she could not immediately place. A small embroidered mark worked so subtly into the leather that most eyes would pass over it entirely. This mark, she said slowly, holding it up toward the lamplight. I have seen it before, not recently, on a ledger, I think, one I dusted in the record room months ago and never thought twice about. Which ledger? Draven asked, leaning forward. I don't remember exactly, Mira admitted, frustration creeping into her voice. I clean that room perhaps once a season. It could have belonged to any noble house that keeps accounts through the castle steward. I would need to see the room again to be certain. Then we'll see it again, Draven said, rising from his chair. Tonight, if the steward permits it, or tomorrow at first light if he does not. Nathaniel excused himself to continue the search along the outer wall where the rope had been found, leaving Draven and Mira alone with the small scrap of leather and the quiet, uneasy feeling that the answer to who had fired that arrow sat closer to the castle's own halls than either of them wanted to admit. If the mark belongs to someone within this court, Mira said carefully, someone who sits at that council table, this becomes considerably more dangerous than simply finding an outside enemy to punish. I know, Draven said, which is exactly why we move carefully, and why we say nothing of this glove to the full council until we know more. If Edmund Caro or anyone else at that table is involved, an early accusation without proof only warns them to hide their tracks more carefully. Mira nodded, though the mention of Edmund's name settled uneasily in her chest, confirming a suspicion she had not yet found the courage to say aloud. She thought again of the shadow Agatha had mentioned lingering near her chamber door the previous night, of Edmund's carefully neutral expression throughout the council meeting, of the way his eyes had followed her more closely than anyone else's at that long table. She said nothing of it yet, not until the ledger confirmed what her instincts already suspected. The record room sat at the far end of the castle's western wing, a narrow, dust-filled space, lined with shelves of ledgers stretching back decades, and Mira led Draven through it the following morning with the careful memory of someone who had spent countless quiet hours dusting shelves nobody else bothered to look at closely. Here, she said, running her fingers along a row of leather-bound books until she found the one she remembered, a ledger recording trade accounts for noble households that used the castle steward to manage their imported goods. She pulled it free and opened it across the reading table, scanning page after page until her finger stopped on a small embroidered mark stamped beside a column of figures. The same subtle pattern worked into the scrap of leather Nathaniel had found near the eastern windows. Draven leaned over her shoulder to look, and his jaw tightened the moment he saw the name recorded beside the mark. Caro, he read aloud, though the word came out low, controlled, a man forcing calm over something that clearly cost him effort to control. Southern leather goods, imported quarterly, paid through the Caro household accounts. Mira felt the confirmation settle over her like a cold weight, though it brought her no satisfaction, only a grim certainty that the danger she had sensed since the council meeting had not been imagination after all. It could still belong to someone in his household, rather than Edmund himself, she said carefully, though even she did not fully believe the possibility as she said it. Perhaps, Draven said, but Edmund Caro's father sat on my father's council during the Second Purge. I remember hearing the name mentioned in old records, though I was young enough at the time that I never understood what role it played. If the Caro family helped orchestrate the destruction of your bloodline once already, it would explain a great deal about why Edmund reacted the way he did the moment your gift revealed itself in that hall. Not shock. Recognition. The pieces settled into place with an unpleasant clarity, and Mira found herself replaying every interaction she'd had with Edmund Caro over 3 years of quiet service. Every smooth, careful smile that had never once reached his eyes. Every moment his gaze had lingered on her a beat longer than politeness required. She had trusted her instincts about him from the very first week she arrived at Blackthorn Keep. She simply had not understood, until now, exactly how much reason those instincts had to be correct. If Edmund fired that arrow, or ordered it fired, Draven said, he did not do it simply to end my life. He did it because the summit brought every pack leader in the region into one hall, and my death during a failed peace summit would have thrown this entire region into exactly the kind of chaos his family profits from managing behind the scenes. And if he recognized what you were the moment you healed, he now has 2 reasons to want both of us gone rather than 1. They moved quickly after that, Draven summoning Nathaniel and 2 guards he trusted completely, men who owed their positions to merit rather than council favor, and together they made a plan to confront Edmund Caro before he had any further opportunity to cover his tracks or arrange a second attempt. They found him in his private study that evening, seated calmly behind a wide desk covered in papers, as though he had spent the entire day attending to nothing more dangerous than trade correspondence. He looked up when Draven entered with Mira and the guards close behind, and for just a moment, something flickered behind his composed expression, gone so quickly that Mira might have imagined it if she had not spent 3 years learning to read exactly that kind of careful, controlled reaction. Your Majesty, Edmund said, rising from his chair with practiced calm, this is an unexpected visit. We found a glove near the eastern windows, Draven said, setting the scrap of leather on the desk between them, matched to imports paid through your household accounts. I would like to hear your explanation before this conversation moves any further. Edmund studied the leather scrap for a long moment, and Mira watched him carefully, waiting for the mask to slip the way it had slipped for that brief instant when Draven first walked through the door. A glove, Edmund said slowly, proves very little on its own, Your Majesty. Many households purchase southern leather. It hardly constitutes evidence of an assassination attempt. Your father sat on the council that ordered the Renfell purge, Mira said, before Draven could respond. You recognized my bloodline the moment my eyes changed color in that hall. Not confusion, recognition. I saw it on your face before you had time to arrange your expression into something more careful. For the first time since Mira had known him, Edmund Caro's composed mask cracked fully, something colder and sharper showing through underneath. A man who had spent years building careful walls around his true intentions, now watching those walls crumble faster than he could rebuild them. You have no idea what your family truly was, he said, his voice losing its earlier smoothness entirely. Guardians bound to a throne, the old stories called you. But bindings work in both directions, don't they? A guardian bound to protect a throne is also a guardian capable of choosing which throne deserves protecting and which does not. My father spent his entire life terrified that a Renfell healer might one day decide this throne no longer deserved the old oath, and instead lend that gift to whichever rival pack offered a better claim. He did not eliminate your family out of cruelty. He did it out of fear that your bloodline's loyalty could never be fully trusted, only borrowed. That fear killed children, Mira said, her voice steady despite the old grief rising sharp in her chest. "It killed my grandmother, my parents, cousins who had done nothing but exist with the wrong blood in their veins. Whatever your father feared, he answered it with slaughter instead of trust, and now you've tried to finish what he started, against a king who never asked for that legacy, and clearly does not want it." "You speak of bindings and old oaths," Mira said, "as though my family ever asked to be born into either. Nobody consults a child about which throne her blood will someday be expected to protect or betray. You built an entire justification for slaughter out of a fear that was never tested, never proven, only assumed because it was easier to destroy a possibility than to trust a person." "Easier and safer," Edmund said. "Your grandmother could have sworn loyalty to this throne 1,000 times over, and it would have changed nothing in my father's mind. He had watched 2 other guardian bloodlines shift their loyalty when the political winds changed in neighboring territories. He was not willing to gamble this throne's survival on the hope that the Renfell line would prove different. The king is young," Edmund said, "and idealistic, and entirely unprepared for what happens when 4 packs stop trusting each other's borders the moment real pressure arrives. Peace summits fail eventually. They always do. I simply intended to control how this one failed, and who benefited from the chaos that followed, rather than leave it to chance." "And Mira," Draven said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Why target her specifically, once you realized what she was?" "Because a healer capable of surviving nightroot poison is a resource no single throne should be permitted to keep entirely to itself," Edmund said. "Once her gift became known, every pack leader at that summit would have spent the following months maneuvering to claim her loyalty for their own territory instead of yours. I judged it simpler to remove the complication before it could grow into a war fought over who deserved to own her gift. I still believe that judgment was correct, even now." "She is not a resource to be owned," Draven said, stepping forward. "She is a person who chose, freely, to protect a throne that owed her family an apology rather than another arrow. You do not get to decide her value for her, and you certainly do not get to decide it by ending lives to control the outcome." Edmund's hand moved suddenly toward a drawer at the edge of his desk, fast enough that Nathaniel and the other guards surged forward immediately, but Mira, closer than any of them, moved faster still, her hand closing over Edmund's wrist before the drawer had fully opened, her grip stronger than any ordinary maid's grip had any right to be. "Don't," she said quietly. Edmund froze, staring at her hand locked around his wrist, at the calm, steady strength in her eyes that had nothing left in it to hide now that the truth stood fully exposed between them. Whatever weapon he had reached for stayed exactly where it was, and the guards closed the remaining distance a moment later, disarming him fully and pulling him back from the desk while Draven watched with an expression carved from cold, controlled fury. "Take him to the lower chambers," Draven ordered. "Under full guard, this matter will be brought before the full council at first light, with every piece of evidence laid out plainly, and every pack leader present will hear exactly what his family attempted twice now against a bloodline that never once threatened this throne, except in his own father's fearful imagination." The guards led Edmund away, his composed mask gone entirely now, replaced by a bitter, resigned silence that told Mira more clearly than any confession could have that everything he had said in that study had been the truth, as he understood it, however twisted that understanding had become over years of inherited fear. The council convened the next morning exactly as Draven promised, and this time Mira sat at that long table not as a secret revealed against her will, but as a woman who had helped uncover the very conspiracy that had nearly killed a king. The evidence laid before the pack leaders left little room for doubt. The matched gloves, the ledger entry, Edmund's own words spoken in his study witnessed by Draven, Mira, and 3 guards whose testimony aligned without contradiction. Lord Callum Bryce, who had argued only days earlier that Mira's bloodline carried obligations the council might use for its own purposes, now looked at her with something closer to respect than suspicion. "It seems," he said slowly, "that this council owes you an apology of its own, for the manner in which we discussed your presence here rather than simply asking what you wished for yourself. An apology accepted, Mira said, though what I wish for now is simpler than anything this council debated. I wish for the packs gathered here to leave this summit trusting each other a little more than they arrived trusting each other, rather than less. That was the entire purpose of this gathering before an arrow interrupted it, and I would rather see that purpose survive than watch it become another casualty of what Edmund Caro attempted. In the days between Edmund's confession and the summit's resumption, word of what had happened spread quietly through the lower halls of the castle, and Agatha found Mira in the kitchen one evening, folding linens out of old habit, even though nobody expected her to work anymore. "You don't have to do that," Agatha said gently, nodding at the linens. "I know," Mira said. "It steadies my hands. 6 years of hiding leaves a person with very few habits that feel calm instead of careful, and folding linens happens to be one of the only ones I have left." Agatha sat across from her at the worn kitchen table, the same table where she had pressed a warm roll into Mira's palm the very morning the arrow first flew. "There is a boy in the eastern quarter," she said after a moment. "The blacksmith's son, burned badly 2 days ago tending his father's forge. The healer has done what she can, but the wound festers, and the family has little money left for stronger remedies. I do not ask this of you lightly, knowing what it costs you to be seen using your gift, but I thought you should know he exists, in case you wish to choose for yourself whether to help him." Mira set down the linen in her hands. She thought of the grain cellar, of 6 years of borrowed names, of a healing power she had spent her whole life treating as a danger to be hidden, rather than a gift to be offered. Edmund Caro's father had feared exactly this, a Renfell healer choosing where her loyalty and her gift belonged. Mira found, sitting in that warm kitchen, that she wanted very much to prove him wrong in the gentlest way available to her. She visited the blacksmith's son that same evening, and though her gift did not work the same miraculous way it had against the nightroot poison, needing no life-threatening wound to wake it fully, she found that a slower, steadier warmth still passed from her hands into his burned skin, easing the fever and closing the worst of the wound enough that the healer declared, 2 days later, that the boy would keep his arm after all. Word of it moved through the eastern quarter quietly, respectfully, and for the first time in her life, Mira felt her family's old gift spoken of with gratitude rather than fear. The summit resumed in the days that followed, slower and more careful than before, but steadier for having survived its greatest test intact. The 4 packs signed their agreements before departing, each leader carrying home not just terms of peace, but a story that would travel with them regardless, of a maid who took an arrow meant for a king and revealed, in the same breath, a truth about an old, buried cruelty finally answered rather than repeated. Draven found Mira on the eastern balcony some weeks later, watching the last of the visiting pack banners being taken down from the Great Hall's rafters, the castle slowly returning to its ordinary rhythm after weeks of tension and revelation. "You could leave now, if you wanted," Draven said, standing beside her at the railing. "The danger that kept you hiding for 6 years is answered. Edmund's plot is exposed, his father's crimes acknowledged publicly rather than buried in old records nobody reads. Nothing binds you to Blackthorn Keep any longer." Mira considered the question seriously, because it deserved a serious answer rather than a quick, comfortable one. "I spent 6 years running towards safety," she said. "I find I am tired of running, now that I finally have somewhere worth staying instead." "And is that where you wish to stay?" Draven asked. "Here, specifically, with everything this castle represents to your family's history." "Not because of what this castle represents," Mira said, turning to look at him fully. "Because of who stood beside me in that council chamber and refused to let an old fear decide my value before I could decide it myself. That is not something I found in 6 years of hiding in other places, Draven. I would rather stay and build something new here than keep searching elsewhere for something I have already found." Draven's expression softened into something Mira had not seen from him in 3 years of quiet service, something unguarded and entirely without the careful weight of a crown pressing down on it. "Then stay," he said simply, "not as a maid hiding a name, and not as a guardian bound by an old oath neither of us fully understands. Stay as yourself, Mira Renfell, seen fully, for exactly who she chooses to be. Below them, the last banner came down from the great hall's rafters, carried away by servants who had no idea how close that hall had come to becoming a battlefield instead of the site of a fragile, hard-won peace. Mira watched it go, and for the first time in 6 years felt no urge at all to disappear along with it. The girl who once scrubbed floors to stay invisible had finally stopped needing to hide, and the truth that once threatened to end her had become, instead, the very thing that let her begin.